It's January 26th, 3:39 p.m. Today we're going to read Yoga for Yellow Bellies, the first lecture. This is the fifth lecture in 8 lectures on yoga. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Let us begin this evening by going briefly over the ground covered by my first 4 lectures. I told you that yoga meant union, and that this union was the cause of all phenomena. Consciousness results from a conjunction of a mysterious stimulus with a mysterious sensorium. The kind of yoga which is the subject of these remarks is merely an expansion of this, the union of self-consciousness with the universe. We spoke of the 8 limbs of yoga and dealt with the 4 which referred to the physical training of experiences. The remaining 4 deal with mental training and experiences, and these form the subject of the ensuing remarks. Before we deal with these in detail, I think it would be helpful to consider the formula of yoga from what may be called the mathematical or magical standpoint. This formula has been described in my textbook on magic, Chapter 3, the formula of Tetragrammaton. This formula covers the entire universe of magical operations. The word usually pronounced Jehovah is called the ineffable name. It is alleged that when pronounced accurately, its vibrations would destroy the universe, and this is indeed quite true when we take the deeper interpretation. Tetragrammaton is so called from the 4 letters in the word Yod, He, Vow, and He. This is compared with the relations of a family, Yod the father, He the mother, Vow the son, and the final He the daughter. In writing, she is sometimes distinguished from her mother by inserting a small point in the letter. There is also a reference to the elements fire, water, air, earth. I may go further and say that all possible existing things are to be classed as related to one or more of these elements, for convenience in certain operations. But these 4 letters, though in one sense they represent the eternal framework, are not, so to speak, original. For instance, when we place Tetragrammaton on the Tree of Life, the 10 Sephiroth or numbers, we do not include the first Sephirah. Yod is referred to the second, He to the third, Vow to the group from 4 to 9, and He final to the 10th. Number 1 is said to be symbolized by the top point of the Yod. It is only in number 10 that we get the manifested universe, which is thus shown as the result of the yoga of the other forces. In the first 3 letters of the name, the active elements fire, water, and air. These are the 3 mother letters in the Hebrew alphabet. The last element, earth, is usually considered a sort of consolidation of the 3, but that is rather an unsatisfactory way of regarding it, because if we admit the reality of the universe at all, we are in philosophical chaos. However, this does not concern us for the moment. When we apply these symbols to yoga, we find that fire represents the yogi, and water the object of his meditation. You can, if you like, reverse these attributions. It makes no difference except to the metaphysician, and precious little to him. The Yod and the He combine, the father and the mother unite, to produce a son, Vow. This son is the exalted state of mind produced by the union of the subject and the object. This state of mind is called Samadhi in the Hindu terminology. It has many varieties of constantly increasing sublimity, but it is the generic term which implies the union which is the subject of yoga. At this point, we ought to remember poor little He final, who represents the ecstasy, shall I say the orgasm, or ananda, and the absorption thereof, the compensation which cancels it. I find it excessively difficult to express myself. It is one of these ideas which is very deeply seated in my mind as a result of constant meditation, but I feel that I am being entirely feeble when I say the best translation of the letter He final would be ecstasy rising into silence. Moral: meditate yourselves and work it out. Finally, there is no other way. I think it is very important, since we are studying yoga from a strictly scientific point of view, to emphasize the exactness of the analogy that exists between the yogic and the sexual process. If you look at the Tree of Life, you see that the number 1 at the top divides itself into numbers 2 and 3. The equal and opposite father and mother and their union results in the complexity of the son, the Vow group, while the whole figure recovers its simplicity in the single Sephirah of He final of the daughter. It is exactly the same in biology. The spermatozoon and the ovum are biologically the separation of an unmanifested single cell, which is in its function simple, though it contains in itself in a latent form all the possibilities of the original single cell. Their union results in the manifestation of these qualities in the child. Their potentialities are expressed and developed in terms of time and space, while also accompanying the act of union is the ecstasy which is the natural result of the consciousness of their annihilation, the necessary condition of the production of their offspring. It would be easy to develop this thesis by analogies drawn from ordinary human experiences of the growth of passion, the hunger accompanying it, the intense relief and joy afforded by satisfaction. I like rather to think of the fact that all true religion has been the artistic, the dramatic representation of the sexual process, not merely because of the usefulness of this cult in tribal life, but as the veil of this truer meaning which I am explaining to you tonight. I think that every experience in life should be regarded as a symbol of the truer experience of the deeper life. In the oath of a master of the temple occurs the clause, "I will interpret every phenomenon as a particular dealing of God with my soul." It is not for us to criticize the Great Order for expressing its idea in terms readily understandable by the ordinary intelligent person. We are to wave aside the metaphysical implications of the phrase and grasp its obvious meaning. So every act should be an act of yoga, and this leads us directly to the question which we have postponed until now: concentration. Concentration. The sexual analogy still serves us. Do you remember the abbé in Browning? Asked to preside at the court of love, he gave the prize to the woman the object of whose passion was utterly worthless in this admirable judgment. The love which to one, and one only, has reference, seems terribly like what perhaps gains God's preference. It is a commonplace, and in some circumstances, such as constantly are found among foul-minded Anglo-Saxons, a sort of joke that lovers are lunatics. Everything at their command is pressed into the service of their passion, every kind of sacrifice, every kind of humiliation, every kind of discomfort. These all count for nothing. Every energy is strained and twisted, every energy is directed to the single object of its end. The pain of a momentary separation seems intolerable, the joy of consummation impossible to describe, indeed almost impossible to bear. Now this is exactly what the yogi has to do. All the books, they disagree on every other point, but they agree on this stupidity. Tell him that he has to give up this and give up that, sometimes on sensible grounds, more often on grounds of prejudice and superstition. In the advanced stages, one has to give up the very virtues which have brought one to that state. Every idea, considered as an idea, is lumber, dead weight, poison. But it is all wrong to represent these acts as acts of sacrifice. There is no question of depriving oneself of anything one wants. The process is rather that of learning to discard what one thought one wanted in the darkness before the dawn of the discovery of the real object of one's passion. Hence, note well, concentration has reduced our moral obligations to their simplest terms. There is a single standard to which everything is to be referred. To hell with the Pope. If lobster Newburg upsets your digestion, and good digestion is necessary to your practice, then you do not eat lobster Newburg. Unless this is clearly understood, the yogi will constantly be sidetracked by the sophistications of religious and moral fanatics. To hell with the archbishops. You will readily appreciate that to undertake a course of this kind requires careful planning. You have got to map out your life in advance for a considerable period, so far as it is humanly possible to do so. If you have failed in this original strategical disposition, you are simply not going to carry through the campaign. Unforeseen contingencies are certain to arise, and therefore one of our precautions is to have some sort of reserve of resource to fling against unexpected attacks. This is, of course, merely concentration in daily life, and it is the habit of such concentration that prepares one for the much severer task of the deeper concentration of the yoga practices. For those who are undertaking a preliminary course, there is nothing better, while they are still living more or less ordinary lives, than the practices recommended in the Equinox. There must be, a definite routine of acts calculated to remind the student of the great work. The classic of the subject is Liber Astarte vel Berilli, the book of devotion to a particular deity. This book is admirable beyond praise, reviewing the whole subject in every detail with flawless brilliancy of phrase. Its practice is enough in itself to bring the devotee to high attainment. This is only for the few. But every student should make a point of saluting the sun, in the manner recommended in Liber Resh, 4 times daily, and he shall salute the moon on her appearance with the mantra Gayatri. The best way is to say the mantra instantly one sees the moon, to note whether the attention wavers, and to repeat the mantra until it does not waver at all. He should also practice assiduously Liber 3 vel Judorum. The essence of this practice is that you select a familiar thought, word, or gesture, one which automatically recurs fairly often during the day, and every time you are betrayed into using it, cut yourself sharply upon the wrist or forearm with a convenient instrument. There is also a practice which I find very useful when walking in a Christian city, that of exercising, with the prescribed outward and downward sweep of the arm, in the words apo pantos kakodaimonos, any person in religious garb. All these practices assist in concentration, and also serve to keep one on the alert. They form an invaluable preliminary training for the colossal work of genuine concentration, when it comes to be a question of the fine, growing constantly finer movements of the mind. We may now turn to the consideration of yoga practices themselves. I assume that in the fortnight which has elapsed since my last lecture you have all perfected yourselves in asana and pranayama, that you daily balance a saucer brimming with sulfuric acid on your heads for 12 hours without accident, that you all jump about busily like frogs when not seriously levitated, and that your mantra is as regular as the beating of your heart. The remaining 4 limbs of yoga are pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. I will give you the definition of all 4 at a single stroke, as each one to some extent explains the one following. Pratyahara may be roughly described as introspection, but it also means a certain type of psychological experience. For instance, you may suddenly acquire a conviction, as did Sir Humphrey Davy, that the universe is composed exclusively of ideas, or you may have the direct experience that you do not possess a nose, as may happen to the best of us if we concentrate upon the tip of it. Dharana is meditation proper, not the kind of meditation which consists of profound consideration of the subject with the idea of clarifying it or gaining a more comprehensive grasp of it, but the actual restraint of the consciousness to a single imaginary object chosen for the purpose. These 2 limbs of yoga are therefore in a sense the 2 methods implied mentally by the yogi. For long after success in samadhi has been attained, one has to conduct the most extensive explorations into the recesses of the mind. The word dhyana is difficult to define. It is used by many writers in quite contrary senses. The question is discussed at some length in Part 1 of my Book 4. I will quote what I have written about it in conclusion. Let us try a final definition. Dhyana represents samadhi in many respects. There is a union of the ego and the non-ego, and a loss of the senses of time and space and causality. Duality in any form is abolished. The idea of time involves that of 2 consecutive things, that of space 2 non-coincident things, that of causality 2 connected things. Samadhi, on the contrary, is in a way very easy to define. Etymology, aided by the persistence of the religious tradition, helps us here. Sam is a prefix in Sanskrit which developed into the prefix sin in Greek without changing the meaning. Sin in synopsis, synthesis, syndrome, it means together with. Adhi has also come down through many centuries in many tongues. It is one of the oldest words in human language. It dates from the time when each sound had a definite meaning proper to it, a meaning suggested by the muscular movement made in producing the sound. Thus the letter D originally means father, so the original father, dead and made into God, was called Ad. This name came down unchanged to Egypt, as you see in the Book of the Law. The word Adhi in Sanskrit was usually translated Lord. In the Syrian form we get a duplicated Hadad. You remember Ben-Hadad, king of Syria. The Hebrew word for Lord is Adon or Adonai. Adonai, my Lord, is constantly used in the Bible to replace the name Jehovah, where that was too sacred to be mentioned, or for other reasons improper to write down. Adonai has come to mean through the Rosicrucian tradition the holy guardian angel, and thus the object of worship or concentration. It is the same thing. Worship is worthship, means worthiness, and anything but the chosen object is necessary an unworthy object. As dhyana also represents the condition of annihilation of individuality, it is a little difficult to distinguish between it and samadhi. I wrote in Part 1, Book 4, these dhyanic conditions contract those of normal thought, but in samadhi they are very much more marked than in dhyana, and while in the latter it seems like a simple union of 2 things, in the former it appears as if all things rushed together and united. One might say in dhyana that there was still this quality latent, that the one existing was opposed to the many non-existing. In samadhi, the many and the one are united in a union of existence with non-existence. This definition is not made from reflection, but from memory. But that was written in 1911, and since then I have had an immense harvest of experience. I am inclined to say at this moment that dhyana stands to samadhi rather as the jumping about like a frog, described in a previous lecture, does to levitation. In other words, dhyana, an unbalanced or an impure approximation to samadhi. Subject and object unite and disappear with ecstasy amounting to indifference, and so forth, but there is still a preservation of some kind of new genus of consciousness. In this view, dhyana would be rather like an explosion of gunpowder carelessly mixed. Most of it goes off with a bang, but there is some debris of the original components. These discussions are not of very great importance in themselves, because the entire series of the 3 states of meditation proper is summed up in the word samyama. You can translate it quite well for yourself, since you already know that sam means together, and that yama means control. It represents the merging of minor individual acts of control into a single gesture, very much as the separate cells, bones, veins, arteries, nerves, muscles, and so forth, of the arm combine in unconscious unanimity to make a single stroke. Now the practice of pratyahara, properly speaking, is introspection, and the practice of dharana, properly speaking, is the restraint of the thought to a single imaginary object. The former is a movement of the mind, the latter a cessation of all movement. And you are not likely to get much success in pratyahara until you have made considerable advance in dhyana, because by introspection we mean the exploration of the substrata of the consciousness, which are only revealed when we have progressed a certain distance and become aware of conditions which are utterly foreign to normal intellectual conception. The first law of normal thought is A is A, the law of identity it is called. So we can divide the universe into A and not A. There is no third thing possible. Now, quite early in the meditation practices, the yogi is likely to get as a direct experience the consciousness that these laws are not true in any ultimate way. He has reached a world where intellectual conceptions are no longer valid. They remain true for the ordinary affairs of life, but the normal laws of thought are seen to be no more than a mere mechanism, a code of conventions. The students of higher mathematics and metaphysics have often a certain glimmering of these facts. They are compelled to use irrational conceptions for greater convenience in conducting their rational investigations. For example, the square root of 2, or the square root of -1, is not in itself capable of comprehension as such. It pertains to an order of thinking beyond the primitive man's invention of counting on his fingers. It will be just as well for the student to begin with practices of dharana. If he does so, he will obtain as a byproduct some of the results of pratyahara, and he will also acquire considerable insight into the methods of practicing pratyahara. It sounds perhaps at first as if pratyahara were off the main line of attainment in yoga. This is not so, because it enables one to deal with the new conditions which are established in the mind by realization of dhyana and samadhi. I can now describe the elementary practices. You should begin with very short periods. It is most important not to overstrain the apparatus which you are using. The mind must be trained very slowly. In my early days I was often satisfied with a minute or two at a time, 3 or 4 such periods twice or 3 times a day. In the earliest stages of all, it is not necessary to have got very far with asana, because all you can get out of the early practices is really a foreshadowing of the difficulties of doing it. I begin by taking a simple geometrical object in one color, such as a yellow square. I will quote the official instructions in the Equinox. Dharana, control of thought. 1. Constrain the mind to concentrate itself upon a single simple object imagined. The 5 tattvas are useful for this purpose. They are a black oval, a blue disk, a silver crescent, a yellow square, a red triangle. 2. Proceed to combinations of simple objects, e.g. a black oval within a yellow square, and so on. 3. Proceed to simple moving objects, such as a pendulum swinging, a wheel revolving, etc. Avoid living objects. 4. Proceed to combinations of moving objects, e.g. a piston rising and falling while a pendulum is swinging. The relation between the two movements should be varied in different experiments, or even a system of flywheels, eccentrics, and governor. 5. During these practices, the mind must be absolutely confined to the object determined upon. No other thought must be allowed to intrude upon the consciousness. The moving systems must be regular and harmonious. 6. Note carefully the duration of the experiments, the number and nature of the intruding thoughts, the tendency of the object itself to depart from the course laid out for it, and any other phenomena which may present themselves. Avoid to overstrain. This is very important. 7. Proceed to imagine living objects, as a man, preferably some man known to and respected by yourself. 8. In the intervals of these experiments, you may try to imagine the objects of the other senses, and to concentrate upon them. For example, try to imagine the taste of chocolate, the smell of roses, the feeling of velvet, the sound of a waterfall, or the ticking of a watch. 9. Endeavor finally to shut out all objects of any of the senses, and prevent all thoughts arising in your mind. When you feel that you have attained some success in these practices, apply for examination, and should you pass, more complex and difficult practices will be prescribed for you. Now, one of the most interesting and irritating features of your early experiments is interfering thoughts. There is, first of all, the misbehavior of the object which you are contemplating. It changes its color and size, moves its position, gets out of shape, and one of the essential difficulties in practice is that it takes a great deal of skill and experience to become really alert to what is happening. You can go on daydreaming for quite long periods before realizing that your thoughts have wandered at all. This is why I insist so strongly on the practices described above as producing alertness and watchfulness, and you will obviously realize that it is quite evident that one has to be in the pink of condition and in the most favorable mental state in order to make any headway at all. But when you have had a little practice in detecting and counting the breaks in your concentration, you'll find that they themselves are useful because their character is symptomatic of your state of progress. Breaks are classed as follows. Firstly, physical sensations. These should have been overcome by asana. Secondly, breaks that seem to be indicated by events immediately preceding the meditation. Their activity becomes tremendous. Only by this practice does one understand how much is really observed by the senses without the mind becoming conscious of it. Thirdly, there is a class of break partaking of the nature of reverie or daydreaming. These are very insidious. One may go on for a long time without realizing that one has wandered at all. Fourthly, we get a very high class of break, which is a sort of aberration of the control itself. You think how well I am doing it, or perhaps that it would be rather a good idea if you were on a desert island, or if you were in a soundproof house, or if you were sitting by a waterfall. But these are only trifling variations from the vigilance itself. A fifth class of break seems to have no discoverable source in the mind. Such might even take the form of actual hallucination, usually auditory. Of course, such hallucinations are infrequent and are recognized for what they are, otherwise the student had better see a doctor. The usual kind consists of odd sentences or fragments of sentences which are quite distinctly heard in a recognizable human voice, not the student's voice or that of anyone he knows. A similar phenomenon is observed by wireless operators who call such messages atmospherics. There is a further kind of break, which is the desired result itself. I have already indicated how tedious these practices become, how great the bewilderment, how constant the disappointment. Long before the occurrence of Dhyana, there are quite a number of minor results which indicate the breaking up of intellectual limitation. You must not be disturbed if these results make you feel that the very foundations of your mind are being knocked from under you. The real lesson is that, just as you learn in asana, the normal body is in itself nothing but a vehicle of pain, so is the normal mind by itself insane. By its own standards, it is insane. You have only got to read a quite simple and elementary work, like Professor Joad's Guide to Philosophy, to find that any argument carried far long enough leads to a contradiction in terms. There are dozens of ways of showing that if you begin A is A, you end A is not A. The mind reacts against this conclusion. It anesthetizes itself against the self-inflicted wound, and it relegates philosophy to the category of paradoxical tricks. But that is a cowardly and disgraceful attitude. The yogi has got to face the fact that we are all raving lunatics. That sanity exists, if it exists at all, in a mental state free from Dame's school rules of intellect. With an earnest personal appeal, therefore, to come up frankly to the mourner's bench and gibber, I will take my leave of you for this evening. Love is the law, love under will. It's January 26th, 4:26 p.m. We're going to read Chapter 6, Dhyana. This word has two quite distinct and mutually exclusive meanings. The first refers to the result itself. Dhyana is the same word as the Pali jhana. The Buddha counted 8 jhanas, which are evidently different degrees and kinds of trance. The Hindu also speaks of dhyana as a lesser form of samadhi. Others, however, treat it as if it were merely an intensification of dharana. Patanjali says dharana is holding the mind onto some particular object. An unbroken flow of knowledge in that object is dhyana. When that, giving up all forms, reflects only the meaning, it is samadhi. He combines these three into samyama. We shall treat of dhyana as a result rather than as a method. Up to this point, ancient authorities have been fairly reliable guides, except with regard to their crabbed ethics. But when they get on the subject of results of meditation, they completely lose their heads. They exhaust the possibilities of poetry to declare what is demonstrably untrue. For example, we find in the Siva Samhita that he who daily contemplates on this lotus of the heart is eagerly desired by the daughters of gods, has clairaudience, clairvoyance, and can walk in the air. Another person can make gold, discover medicine for disease, and see hidden treasures. All this is filth. What is the curse upon religion that its tenets must always be associated with every kind of extravagance and falsehood? There is one exception. It is the AA, whose members are extremely careful to make no statement at all that cannot be verified in the usual manner, or where this is not easy, at least avoid anything like a dogmatic statement. In their second book of practical instruction, Liber occur these words: by doing certain things, certain results will follow. Students are most earnestly warned against attributing objective reality or philosophical validity to any of them. Those golden words. In discussing Dhyana, then, let it be clearly understood that something unexpected is about to be described. We shall consider its nature and estimate its value in a perfectly unbiased way, without allowing ourselves the usual rhapsodies or deducing any theory of the universe. One extra fact may destroy some existing theory. That is common enough, but no single fact is sufficient to construct one. It will have been understood that dharana, dhyana, and samadhi form a continuous process, and exactly when the climax comes does not matter. It is of this climax that we must speak, for this is a matter of experience, and a very striking one. In the course of our concentration, we noticed that the contents of the mind at any moment consisted of 2 things, and no more: the object, variable, and the subject, invariable, or apparently so. By success in dharana, the object has been made as invariable as the subject. Now the result of this is that the two become one. The phenomenon usually comes as a tremendous shock. It is indescribable even by the masters of language, and it is therefore not surprising that semi-educated stutterers wallow in oceans of gush. All the poetic faculties and all the emotional faculties are thrown into a sort of ecstasy by an occurrence which overthrows the mind, and makes the rest of life seem absolutely worthless in comparison. Good literature is principally a matter of clear observation and good judgment expressed in the simplest way. For this reason, none of the great events of history, such as earthquakes and battles, have been well described by eyewitnesses. unless those eyewitnesses were out of danger. But even when one has become accustomed to dhyana by constant repetition, no words seem adequate. One of the simplest forms of dhyana may be called the sun. The sun is seen, as it were, by itself, not by an observer, and although the physical eye cannot behold the sun, one is compelled to make the statement that this sun is far more brilliant than the sun of nature. The whole thing takes place on a higher level. Also, the conditions of thought, time, and space are abolished. It is impossible to explain what this really means. Only experience can furnish you with apprehension. This too has its analogies in ordinary life. The conceptions of higher mathematics cannot be grasped by the beginner, cannot be explained to the layman. A further development is the appearance of the form, which has been universally described as human, although the persons describing it proceed to add a great number of details which are not human at all. This particular appearance is usually assumed to be God. But, whatever it may be, the result on the mind of the student is tremendous. All his thoughts are pushed to their greatest development. He sincerely believes that they have the divine sanction. Perhaps he supposes that they emanate from this God. He goes back into the world armed with this intense conviction and authority. He proclaims his ideas without the restraint which is imposed upon most persons by doubt, modesty, and diffidence. This lack of restraint is not to be confused with that observed in intoxication and madness, yet there is very striking similarity, though only a superficial one. While further there is, one may suppose, a real clarification. In any case, the mass of mankind is always ready to be swayed by anything thus authoritative and distinct. History is full of stories of officers who have walked unarmed up to a mutinous regiment and disarmed them by the mere force of confidence. The power of the orator over the mob is well known. It is probably for this reason that the prophet has been able to constrain mankind to obey his law. It never occurs to him that anyone can do otherwise. In practical life, one can walk past any guardian, such as a sentry or ticket collector, if one can really act so that the man is somehow persuaded that you have a right to pass unchallenged. This power, by the way, is what has been described by magicians as the power of invisibility. Somebody or other has an excellent story of 4 quite reliable men who were on the lookout for a murderer, and had instructions to let no one pass, and who all swore subsequently in presence of the dead body that no one had passed. None of them had seen the postman. The thieves who stole the Gioconda from the Louvre were probably disguised as workmen, and stole the picture under the very eye of the guardian, very likely got him to help them. It is only necessary to believe that a thing must be to bring it about. This belief must not be in an emotional or an intellectual one. It resides in a deeper portion of the mind, yet a portion not so deep that most men, probably all successful men, will understand these words, having experience of their own with which they can compare it. The most important factor in dhyana is, however, the annihilation of the ego. Our conception of the universe must be completely overturned if we are to admit this as valid, and it is time that we considered what is really happening. It will be conceded that we have given a very rational explanation of the greatness of great men. They had an experience so overwhelming, so out of proportion to the rest of things, that they were freed from all the petty hindrances which prevent the normal man from carrying out his projects. Worrying about clothes, food, money, what people think, how and why, and above all the fear of consequences, clogged nearly everyone. Nothing is easier, theoretically, than for an anarchist to kill a king. He has only to buy a rifle, make himself a first-class shot, and shoot the king from a quarter of a mile away. And yet, although there are plenty of anarchists, outrages are very few. At the same time, the police would probably be the first to admit that if any man were really tired of life in his deepest being, a state very different from that which a man goes about saying he is tired of life, he could manage somehow or other to kill someone first. Now the man who has experienced any of the more intense forms of dhyana is thus liberated. The universe is thus destroyed for him, and he for it. His will can therefore go on its way unhampered. One may imagine that in the case of Mohammed, he had cherished for years a tremendous ambition, and never done anything because those qualities which were subsequently manifested as statesmanship warned him that he was impotent. His vision in the cave gave him that confidence which was required, the faith that moves mountains. There are a lot of solid-seeming things in this world which a child could push over, but not one has the courage to push. Let us accept provisionally this explanation of greatness, and pass it by. Ambition has led us to this point, but we are now interested in the work for its own sake. A most astounding phenomenon has happened to us. We have had an experience which makes love, fame, rank, ambition, wealth look like 30 cents, and we begin to wonder passionately what is truth. The universe has tumbled about our ears like a house of cards, and we have tumbled too. Yet this ruin is like the opening of the gates of heaven. Here is a tremendous problem. There is something within us which ravens for its solutions. Let us see what explanation we can find. The first suggestion which would enter a well-balanced mind, versed in the study of nature, is that we have experienced a mental catastrophe.
Just as a blow on the head will make a man see stars, so one might suppose that the terrific mental strain of dharana has somehow excited the brain and caused a spasm, or possibly even a breaking of a small vessel. There seems no reason to reject this explanation altogether, though it would seem quite absurd to suppose that to accept it would be to condemn the practice. Spasm is a normal function of at least one of the organs of the body. That the brain is not damaged by the practice is proved by the fact that many people who claim to have had this experience repeatedly continue to exercise the ordinary avocations of life without diminished activity. We must dismiss, then, the physiological question. It throws no light on the main problem, which is the value of the testimony of the experience. Now, this is a very difficult question and raises the much larger question as to the value of any testimony. Every possible thought has been doubted at some time or another, except the thought which can only be expressed by a note of interrogation, since to doubt that thought asserts it. For a full discussion, see The Soldier and the Hunchback. But apart from this deep-seated philosophical doubt, there is a practical doubt of every day. The popular phrase, to doubt the evidence of one's senses, shows us that evidence is normally accepted, but a man of science does nothing of the sort. He is so well aware that his senses constantly deceive him that he invents elaborate instruments to correct them, and he is further aware that the universe which he can directly perceive through sense is the minutest fraction of the universe which he knows indirectly. For example, 4/5 of the air is composed of nitrogen. If anyone were to bring a bottle of nitrogen into this room, it would be exceedingly difficult to say what it was. Nearly all the tests that one could apply to it would be negative. His senses tell him little or nothing. Argon was only discovered at all by comparing the weight of chemically pure nitrogen with that of the nitrogen of the air. This had often been done, but no one had sufficiently fine instruments even to perceive the discrepancy. To take another example, a famous man of science asserted not so long ago that science could never discover the chemical composition of the fixed stars, yet this has been done, and with certainty. If you were to ask your man of science for his theory of the real, he would tell you that the ether, which cannot be perceived in any way by any of the senses, or detected by any instruments, and which possesses qualities which are to use ordinary language impossible, is very much more real than the chair he is sitting on. The chair is only one fact, and its existence is testified by one very fallible person. The ether is the necessary deduction for millions of facts which have been verified again and again and checked by every possible test of truth. There is therefore no a priori reason for rejecting anything on the ground that it is not directly perceived by the senses. To turn to another point, one of our tests of truth is the vividness of the impression. An isolated event in the past of no great importance may be forgotten, and if it be in some way recalled, one may find oneself asking, did I dream it? Or did it really happen? What can never be forgotten is the catastrophic. The first death among the people that one loves, for example, would never be forgotten. For the first time one would realize what one had previously merely known. Such an experience sometimes drives people insane. Men of science have been known to commit suicide when their pet theory has been shattered. This problem has been discussed freely in Science and Buddhism, Time, The Camel, and other papers. This much only need we say in this place, that Dhyana has to be classed as the most vivid and catastrophic of all experiences. This will be confirmed by anyone who has been there. It is therefore difficult to overrate the value that such an experience has for the individual, especially as it is his entire conception of things, including his most deep-seated conception, the standard to which he has always referred everything, his own self, that is overthrown, and when we try to explain it away as hallucination, temporary suspension of the faculties of something similar, we find ourselves unable to do so. You cannot argue with a flash of lightning that has knocked you down. Any mere theory is easy to upset. One can find flaws in the reasoning process, one can assume that the premises are in some way false, but in this case if one attacks the evidence of Dhyana, the mind is staggered by the fact that all other experience, attacked on the same lines, will fall much more easily. In whatever way we examine it, the result will always be the same. Dhyana may be false, but if so, so is everything else. Now the mind refuses to rest in a belief of the unreality of its own experiences. It may not be what it seems, but it must be something, and if on the whole ordinary life is something, how much more must that be by whose light ordinary life seems nothing? The ordinary man sees the falsity and disconnectedness and purposelessness of dreams. He ascribes them rightly to a disordered mind. The philosopher looks upon waking life with similar contempt, and the person who has experienced Dhyana takes the same view, but not by mere pale intellectual conviction. Reasons, however cogent, never convince utterly, but this man in Dhyana has the same commonplace certainty that a man has on waking from a nightmare. I wasn't falling down 1,000 flights of stairs, it was only a bad dream. Similarly comes the reflection of the man who has had the experience of Dhyana. I am not that wretched insect, that imperceptible parasite of earth, it was only a bad dream. And as you could not convince the normal man that his nightmare was more real than his waking, so you cannot convince that the other, that is Dhyana, was hallucination, even though he is only too well aware that he has fallen from that state into normal life. It is probably rare for a single experience to upset thus radically the whole conception of the universe, just as sometimes in the first moments of waking there remains a half-doubt as to whether dream or waking is real. But as one gains further experience, when Dhyana is no longer a shock, when the student has plenty of time to make himself at home in the new world, this conviction will become absolute. It should be remembered that at present there are no data for determining the duration of Dhyana. One can only say that since it certainly occurred between such and such hours, it must have lasted then less than that time. Thus we see from Frater P's record that it can certainly occur in less than an hour and 5 minutes. Another rationalist consideration is this. The student has not been trying to excite the mind but to calm it, not to produce any one thought but to exclude all thoughts, for there is no connection between the object of meditation and Dhyana. Why must we suppose a breaking down of the whole process, especially as the mind bears no subsequent traces of any interference, such as pain or fatigue? Surely this once, if never again, the Hindu image expresses the simplest theory. That image is that of a lake into which 5 glaciers move. These glaciers are the senses. While ice, the impressions, is breaking off constantly into the lake, the waters are troubled. If the glaciers are stopped, the surface becomes calm, and then, and only then, can it reflect unbroken the disk of the sun. This sun is the soul, or God. We should, however, avoid these terms for the present on account of their implications. Let us rather speak of this sun as some unknown thing whose presence has been masked by all things known, and by the knower. It is probable, too, that our memory of Dhyana is not of the phenomenon itself, but of the image left thereby on the mind. But this is true of all phenomena, as Berkeley and Kant have proved beyond all question. This matter, then, need not concern us. We may, however, provisionally accept the view that Dhyana is real, more real and thus of more importance to ourselves than all other experience. This state has been described not only by the Hindus and Buddhists, but by Mohammedans and Christians. In Christian writings, however, the deeply seated dogmatic bias has rendered their documents worthless to the average man. They ignore the essential conditions of Dhyana, and insist on the inessential to a much greater extent than the best Indian writers. But to anyone with experience and some knowledge of comparative religion, the identity is certain. We may now proceed to Samadhi.